What would you do if you saw an elderly woman who had done nothing wrong being humiliated in public by a racist cop, forced to submit to his degrading demands, something no person should ever face? What happens next is even more shocking. Just when she's about to lose everything, her son arrives on the scene. But what happens when the very thing she hopes for may not be what she expects? Before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? Ruth had lived through decades of hardship, but she always carried herself with quiet strength. She wasn't the type to demand attention, but everyone in her neighborhood knew her. An elderly black woman with a sharp mind and a kind heart. Every morning, she'd walk the same route, minding her own business, unaware of the danger waiting for her today. Officer Matthews watched her from across the street. He'd seen her before, and every time something about her angered him. Ruth didn't know it, but to him she was just another person to put in their place. A black woman walking around like she owned the world. He couldn't stand it. His authority was something he used to humiliate, and Ruth was the perfect target today. The morning was peaceful, the streets calm. Ruth walked, unaware that this ordinary day would turn into a nightmare. Matthews stood waiting, watching her every move. As Ruth passed by, he made his move. There was no reason for it. She hadn't done anything wrong. But that didn't matter to him. The moment was coming, and Ruth had no idea how quickly her life would change. Ruth didn't know it yet, but today was about to be a day that would change everything. The morning air was crisp, and the sun hadn't fully risen. As usual, she was walking down the street, making her way to the corner store to pick up a few things. She wasn't in a hurry. She was used to these quiet walks, the familiar streets, the same peaceful routine. Life had taught her patience, the art of moving slowly through the world. She didn't mind, but today the world was about to shift under her feet. Officer Matthews stood just a few paces away from Ruth, casually leaning against his patrol car. From the moment Ruth had walked into view, he'd been watching her. Matthews had always been the type to pick out someone who didn't fit his view of the world. And Ruth, an elderly black woman, was the perfect target. He didn't know why it irked him so much, but it did. It always did. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, with grace, with dignity. It made him sick. He wanted to remind her of her place. He wanted her to know that no matter how much dignity she walked with, he could take it away in an instant. He wasn't some regular cop out there just doing his job. Matthews thrived on power. He thrived on the way people cringed when he spoke to them, the way they feared him. And Ruth? She was no different. As Ruth got closer, Matthews pushed himself off the car and slowly made his way toward her. He stepped right into her path. He blocked her way, standing tall, staring down at her. Ruth paused, looking up at the officer, confused. "Good morning, officer," she said softly, trying to move past him, assuming this was just another regular encounter. It wasn't. Matthews raised his hand, stopping her from moving any further. "Where are you going?" he asked, his tone cold and demanding. Ruth looked at him for a moment, confused, but she didn't say anything. It wasn't a strange question for a cop, but something in the air felt different. His eyes, locked onto hers, carried an edge of malice. "I'm just going to the store," she said calmly, trying to brush it off. She could feel her heart rate pick up, but she stayed steady. It wasn't unusual for a cop to stop someone, but this wasn't the usual stop. Something wasn't right. "Show me your ID," he demanded, his voice sharp and forceful. Ruth's face tightened slightly, but she didn't argue. She knew the rules. She slowly reached into her purse and pulled out her ID, handing it to him. As Matthews took the ID from her, Ruth could see the way his fingers curled around it, like he was holding on to something precious. But it wasn't her ID he was interested in. He wasn't checking her identification. He was checking her, testing her. His eyes scanned her face, his expression unyielding. "I don't need to show you anything," Ruth said, trying to keep the situation calm, trying to make him understand. "I haven't done anything wrong." But Matthews was already irritated, and the words meant nothing to him. Without another word, he grabbed her arm roughly. "You've done plenty wrong by being out here on your own, walking like you own the place," he sneered. Ruth flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away. She'd lived long enough to know not to fight back in a situation like this. But she also knew that today, this officer had gone too far. "Let go of me," she said firmly, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. Matthews didn't listen. He twisted her arm a little, trying to break her. His power was undeniable. But Ruth wasn't going to let him win that easily. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, each word like a quiet promise. Matthew's face twisted with disgust. "Oh, you're going somewhere, all right." He yanked her further towards his patrol car, ignoring her protests. Ruth's heart raced as panic started to rise, but she didn't let it show. She kept her body still, her breath controlled, but inside the terror was growing. "Please," Ruth said, her voice quieter now. "I'm just an old woman. I'm not doing anything." "Exactly," Matthews hissed. "You're just a black woman who thinks she's above the law. That's the problem." He sneered at her, and then, with a sudden, twisted motion, he threw her to the ground. Ruth hit the pavement hard, pain shooting through her, but she didn't cry out. She didn't let him see how much he hurt her. She didn't give him the satisfaction. "You'll learn your place," Matthews growled, his voice dripping with malice. Ruth's body ached, but it was the humiliation that cut deeper. She was an elderly woman, someone who should be respected, not dragged through the dirt by a racist cop. Her breath caught in her throat as she pushed herself up, the pain unbearable. Just then, she heard a voice. "Hey, what the hell are you doing to her?" Ruth's eyes flicked up. Her son, Marcus, was standing there, his fists clenched, his face set with a hard determination. He'd been just around the corner, taking a different route to the store, and had seen what was happening. The moment he saw his mother on the ground, he knew he couldn't stand by. Matthews froze, his grip still on Ruth. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. He didn't expect anyone to challenge him. But there, Marcus stood, glaring at him with eyes full of fury. "Let my mother go," Marcus said, his voice full of authority, but calm. His presence was commanding. Matthews looked at Marcus, unsure of what to do. "You need to step back," Matthews growled, trying to assert control. "I'm not going anywhere until you let her go," Marcus said firmly. He stepped forward, his body a shield between his mother and Matthews. Ruth's heart started to slow as she realized Marcus was there, that he wouldn't let this go any further. But Matthews wasn't going to back down easily. He stared at Marcus, his jaw clenched. He hadn't expected a fight. The air was thick with tension. For a moment, time stood still. Matthews tried to pull away from Marcus's gaze, but he couldn't. The power he'd felt earlier, the control he thought he had, slipped away, piece by piece. Ruth stood shakily behind her son, her breath steadying as she realized that something had shifted. The moment she'd feared had turned into the moment she could rely on her family. Marcus wasn't going to let this go. The moment Marcus stepped forward, everything shifted. Ruth's heart skipped a beat as she saw her son standing between her and Matthews, his presence like a shield. Her body still trembled from the fall, but seeing Marcus gave her a sense of calm she hadn't felt since Matthews had grabbed her. She wanted to reach out to him, but she stayed back. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was his, too. The fight for her dignity, the fight against hate. Matthews hesitated. He wasn't used to being challenged. He'd spent his career bullying people, getting away with anything he wanted. No one ever stood up to him. And now, this guy, Marcus, was staring him down like he was just another officer on the beat. Matthew's mind raced. He thought about calling for backup, but he knew that would make him look weak. The crowd was already gathering, some pulling out their phones, whispering under their breath. They saw everything. Matthew's every move was being watched. "You really want to do this?" Matthews sneered, trying to regain his control, trying to make Marcus feel small. But Marcus didn't flinch. "You think you can just come in here and act like a hero? What makes you think you can stop me?" Marcus's voice cut through the air. "I'm not here to play games, officer. Let my mom go, now." Matthews gritted his teeth. His fists clenched. But the more he looked at Marcus, the more he realized something wasn't adding up. This wasn't just some random person. There was something in Marcus's eyes, something fierce, that Matthews couldn't ignore. The cop's grip on Ruth's arm loosened slightly, but he still didn't let go. He wasn't going to back down. Not yet. "You should have stayed out of this," Matthews growled, still trying to assert himself. "You don't know who you're dealing with." But Marcus wasn't backing down either. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man who thinks he can control people because of their skin color. You don't scare me." He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "You're nothing but a bully in uniform. You don't deserve that badge." Matthews blinked. The words stung more than he expected. He had never been called out like this before, but his pride wouldn't let him show it. He looked at Ruth, then back at Marcus. His mind raced, trying to think of a way to put Marcus in his place. He couldn't lose control now. If he did, it would show weakness. And in his world, weakness was the one thing he couldn't afford. The air between them felt electric. Marcus was standing his ground, every inch of his body a challenge to Matthew's power. And Matthews, for the first time in a long time, wasn't sure if he had the upper hand. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Matthews snarled, his face turning red with anger. But Marcus didn't back down. He wasn't scared of Matthews. He had no intention of letting this go. His eyes were locked on Matthews, not giving an inch. Ruth's voice barely registered in the background as she tried to steady herself. "Let her go. Now," Marcus repeated, louder this time, his voice cutting through the tension. The crowd was watching, some of them holding their phones, some whispering quietly. Ruth saw it all, the way the people were reacting, the way they were waiting to see what would happen next. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on her, but in that moment, all she could focus on was Marcus and the fire in his eyes. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for what's right. Matthews's grip on Ruth tightened again, but his gaze shifted. Something had changed in his expression. It wasn't fear, but hesitation. For the first time, he wasn't sure what his next move should be. He had expected this to go one way. He expected Ruth to be quiet, to back down. But Marcus wasn't letting that happen, and the crowd was no longer just watching. They were waiting for Matthews to make his move. "Do you really think people care about what happens to you?" Matthews spat, his words full of venom. "You think anyone's going to stand up for you, for a woman like you?" He turned to the crowd, his words aimed at them now. "Look at her. Look at what she's done." But Marcus's voice was louder. "Look at what you've done. This isn't about my mother anymore. It's about you, officer. It's about what you're doing to people every day. You can't keep getting away with it." There was a beat of silence. Matthews stared at Marcus, then Ruth, as if trying to figure out his next move. But it was clear now that he was losing his grip. For all his rage, for all his hatred, Matthews couldn't force his way through this. Marcus had called his bluff. The crowd could see it. Matthews could feel it. And then it happened. Without warning, a voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Everyone turned. Ruth blinked, surprised. A second officer was walking toward them. But this wasn't just any officer. This was someone Ruth knew. This was her cousin, Chris. He had been working as an undercover cop for years, and Ruth had no idea he was in the force. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Chris walked up to Matthews, his expression calm, but his presence commanding. He didn't even look at Ruth. His focus was entirely on Matthews, who froze when he saw Chris approach. The surprise on Matthews' face was impossible to miss. He had no idea Ruth's family was so close to law enforcement. Matthews blinked, his mouth open for a second before he snapped his attention back to Marcus and Ruth. "You know this guy?" he asked, his voice shaky. Chris stepped closer to Matthews, his tone unwavering. "Yes, I do. And I suggest you take your hands off her." There was a moment of complete silence. Matthews didn't know what to do. His entire world had just been turned upside down. The power he thought he had, gone in an instant. The truth was staring him in the face, and for the first time, Matthews knew he couldn't hide behind his badge anymore. The crowd murmured, some of them stepping back, others just taking in what had happened. Marcus looked at Ruth, then at Chris, and there was a moment, just a brief one, where it felt like the entire world shifted. Matthews slowly stepped back, releasing Ruth's arm. His confidence was gone, replaced by disbelief. For the first time, Ruth saw Matthews truly unsure of himself. The fight was over, and in the end, it was the truth that had won. The tension hung thick in the air. Matthews, still trying to regain his composure after Marcus had called him out, was left standing there like a deer caught in headlights. Ruth's body trembled with the aftershocks of the confrontation, but there was something in her eyes now, something different, something like quiet strength. Now that she knew her son was here to protect her, she could finally breathe, but she wasn't done yet. None of them were. Just as Matthews was about to respond to Chris, the sound of a car door slamming echoed through the stillness of the street. All eyes turned as a man stepped out from behind the crowd. His stride was purposeful, his eyes scanning the scene with a cold intensity that no one had expected. Ruth froze for a moment when she saw him. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him. The man who stepped forward wasn't just anyone. He was another officer, one Ruth had known all her life. This man was someone she hadn't seen in years. A man who was her cousin, but a cousin who had kept his life as a police officer hidden from her. Ruth's cousin, Chris, had known about the department, but she never knew how deep it ran. It was only now, when he walked up to stand beside Marcus, that the truth about him being in law enforcement was revealed. Chris had been undercover for years, and this moment was nothing short of a game-changer. As Chris came closer to Matthews, he didn't even glance at Ruth. His focus was entirely on the officer who had been so quick to push Ruth around. Matthews, who had been standing with his back to Chris, immediately recognized him. His whole body tensed as soon as Chris got close. "You're here," Matthews said, his voice tinged with surprise and disbelief. The realization seemed to hit him like a freight train. "I'm here," Chris replied, his tone calm but firm. He didn't hesitate for a second. He had seen enough. "I need you to step back, Matthews." For a brief moment, Matthews stood still, staring at Chris. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone, least of all a fellow officer, to step in and expose him. Matthews had lived his life under the impression that he could do anything, that his badge gave him permission to act however he wanted. But now, his world was crumbling. The officer he thought was just another bystander was someone who knew the law inside and out, someone who had been keeping tabs on officers like Matthews. "You're one of them," Matthews muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Chris. Chris didn't flinch. "You're damn right I am. But you've forgotten something, Matthews," he said, taking a step forward, making Matthews take a step back. "You're supposed to uphold the law, not use it to hurt people." His voice was steady, unyielding. "I'm here because I've seen what you've been doing. This stops now." Matthews' face grew red with rage as he tried to regain some control. "You're full of shit," he spat, his anger bubbling to the surface. "You're a traitor." "No," Chris said, shaking his head. "You're the one who's been betraying your badge, your oath, and everyone around you." Ruth, still recovering from the shock, stood in stunned silence as her cousin stood up to Matthews. Her mind raced, trying to understand why Chris had kept his law enforcement job a secret for so long. But now, in this moment, everything made sense. Chris had been working to expose the officers who were hurting people. He had seen the things Matthews had done and had known he had to act when the time was right. The revelation hit like a punch to the gut for Matthews. Everything he had done, all the times he had used his position to intimidate and humiliate people, all of it was coming back to him in that instant. The power he thought he had was slipping away, piece by piece. He had underestimated Marcus, underestimated Chris, and above all, he had underestimated Ruth. "You think you're invincible, don't you?" Chris continued, his voice growing colder. "You think no one can touch you. But that's over. It ends here." The crowd, which had been silent up until that point, started to murmur. They had watched the entire situation unfold, and now they saw something they hadn't expected. Accountability. Matthews, who had been acting like a king, was suddenly the one in the hot seat. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him, the weight of his actions closing in on him. Matthews opened his mouth, probably to make some excuse, or to try to talk his way out of it, but he didn't get the chance. Chris raised a hand, silencing him. "I don't want to hear it," Chris said, his voice unwavering. "I've seen enough. You're done." Ruth's mind reeled. She had always known the world wasn't perfect, but seeing her cousin step in like this gave her a strange sense of relief. She realized that not all cops were the same. Not all of them were corrupted by power. Some, like Chris, were willing to do the right thing, no matter the cost. Matthews opened his mouth again, but the words failed him. He had no defense, no way to explain his actions. The truth was clear to everyone now. Ruth, Marcus, and even the crowd had seen the lengths Matthews had gone to, and none of them were willing to let it slide. Without another word, Matthews turned and walked back to his patrol car. His shoulders slumped. his head hanging low, as if the weight of the truth was too much for him to bear. The crowd watched him go, a mixture of relief and disbelief filling the air. For a moment, Ruth couldn't believe it was over. She looked at Marcus, who was standing tall beside her, his eyes filled with a quiet triumph. He had fought for her, and now it was over. She felt the tension leave her body, but it was replaced with a deep sadness. She had never imagined that this would happen to her, that she would find herself in this situation, but somehow it had brought her closer to her son, and to the truth that people like Matthews couldn't get away with it forever. Chris turned to Ruth, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "It's over, Ruth. It's done." Ruth looked at him, still processing everything. For so long, she had carried the weight of injustice on her own shoulders. But now, she didn't have to carry it anymore. The truth had come out, and it had set her free. The sun had risen higher, and the morning felt like it was returning to its peaceful state. But Ruth's heart was still racing, her breath still shallow from the events that had just unfolded. The weight of what had happened, everything that had led up to this moment, still hung in the air like a heavy fog. Matthews was gone, driven away by the truth that no one could ignore. But what did it mean now? What did it mean for Ruth, for Marcus, for the others who had witnessed it? Marcus stood by her side, his expression a mixture of relief and quiet pride. They hadn't just won. They had exposed something much bigger. They had shown everyone that power could be challenged, that justice could be fought for, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Ruth hadn't had much hope for a world that seemed to always keep her down. But in this moment, something had changed. A small victory had been won. Chris, Ruth's cousin, was still there, standing a little ways off, watching the two of them. Ruth turned to him, still trying to process everything. She had known Chris for years, but she had never known what he truly did behind the scenes. The truth about his job as an undercover officer had hit her hard, but now, seeing him stand up for what was right, it all made sense. He hadn't just been playing a role. He had been fighting in his own way, working to expose officers like Matthews. And now, the truth was finally out. "You did good, Chris," Ruth said, her voice quiet, but full of emotion. Chris smiled, though it was tinged with a sadness that only those who had seen the darker sides of the world could understand. "I couldn't have done it without Marcus. Without you." Marcus nodded, his face serious but full of pride. "It's not over," he said, his voice firm. "This is just one victory, but there's more to be done. People like Matthews don't just disappear. They'll keep trying to hurt others." Ruth's heart sank at the thought, but she knew Marcus was right. Matthews might be gone for now, but the damage he'd done couldn't just be erased in a day. It was the kind of thing that took time to undo. But today, at least, Ruth felt a small sliver of hope. She felt like the weight of the world had been lifted, even if only for a moment. Chris nodded. "Exactly. But this is how it begins. This is how we start to change things. One step at a time." Ruth stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. It wasn't easy to accept what had happened. It wasn't easy to face the reality that someone like Matthews had been allowed to operate with such cruelty for so long. But today, justice had been served, and that was something Ruth would never forget. She had spent so many years questioning the world, wondering if things would ever get better. But now she realized something. Change didn't always happen in big moments. Sometimes it happened in small ones, moments where people stood together and said, "Enough is enough." As they stood there, the crowd began to disperse, each person silently going their own way, but not without a glance or a word. Some of them had seen it all unfold, some of them had filmed it on their phones, but one thing was clear. What they had just witnessed would stay with them. Matthews might have been the one in uniform, but he had lost that power today, and it was all thanks to the courage of Ruth, Marcus, and Chris. Ruth turned to her son, her heart swelling with pride. "You saved me today, Marcus," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know how to thank you." Marcus looked at her, his expression softening. "I'm just doing what I should have done a long time ago, Mom. I couldn't let you face that alone. I've been facing things like that all my life," Ruth said, her voice steady, despite the emotion behind it. "But today, I didn't have to face it alone. Today, we fought back together." The realization hit Ruth harder than anything else. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It wasn't just her struggle to survive in a world that seemed built against her. Today, her son had stood by her side, and they had done something incredible. They had changed the course of what could have been another tragic moment into something empowering. They had reminded the world that no one should be treated this way, and that there was power in standing up for what's right. Chris watched them both, a soft smile on his lips. "That's what it's all about," he said quietly. "People standing together, fighting for each other." Ruth nodded, her eyes full of emotion. "We might not be able to change everything all at once, but today we made a difference." And in that moment, Ruth realized the truth she had been missing all along. Change wasn't just about waiting for someone else to fix things. It was about the courage to act when the time came. It was about standing up, speaking out, and saying, "No more." Marcus turned to her, his eyes full of determination. "We can't stop here, Mom. There's still a lot of work to do." Ruth nodded again, her heart swelling with pride for her son. The world might be broken, but in that moment, they had proved that it could be repaired, piece by piece. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But they had taken the first step toward something better. As they walked away together, the crowd finally scattered, their voices fading into the distance. Ruth and Marcus didn't say much as they walked side by side, but they didn't need to. They had made their statement. They had made their stand. And that was all that mattered. As Ruth and Marcus walked away side by side, something inside Ruth clicked. She had spent her whole life feeling like the world was against her, like every step she took was a battle. But today, things had changed. Today, she'd stood up to injustice, and, with the help of her son and Chris, had seen it defeated. She had witnessed a moment where justice truly prevailed, and for the first time in a long time, Ruth could feel a little bit of hope for the future. But as they walked into the unknown, Ruth knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. There were still so many people out there who were suffering, who were being hurt by people in positions of power. The fight for justice wasn't one she could win alone. It was going to take everyone, every voice, every person who was willing to stand up and say enough was enough. Have you ever faced a moment where the truth changed everything? Ruth thought to herself. That's what this was. The truth had come out, and it had broken the chains of fear that had bound them for so long. It was in that moment that Ruth realized the power of the truth that could expose evil, the truth that could stand up to cruelty, and the truth that could set people free. So, what are you going to do when it's your turn to speak up? Will you stay silent, or will you stand up for what's right? Because, at the end of the day, it's not enough to watch from the sidelines. We all have a role to play in making the world a better place. Let us know in the comments. What do you think is the most powerful weapon against injustice? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we think about the world.